God bless. You will not have war.
Through this stupid president, $350 billion.
You voted
we gave
for
you
your
military equipment.
So by now, we've all probably heard about the disastrous Trump-Zelensky meeting that took place in the White House last week. Unprecedented, humiliating, a total disaster. That's just some of the ways this meeting is being described. Now, the showdown between Trump and Zelensky itself has been a spectacle. But it's a lot more than just a spectacle or a spat between two world leaders. It's a sign actually that the world is changing, and it's changing in a big way. India and really the whole world have to pay attention to that meeting and what came after it. So in this episode of Threadbare, we're going to be talking about 5 big lessons that India and actually the world can learn from the Trump-Zelensky showdown. Lesson 1 is that the great Western alliance is finally loosening. For the last 80 years, America and its allies in Europe have really dominated global politics. NATO was the largest military alliance in the world for 80 years. The United States and its European allies make up around 40% of global GDP. It used to be even higher. They won the Cold War together and have dominated geopolitics for the last 30 years. But now that alliance is loosening. Over the last 6 weeks, Donald Trump and his administration have launched one shock after another at Europe. They've interfered in European politics, they've lectured the Europeans about values, they've slammed Europe's overregulated economy. This is bad, but it could still be forgiven by Europe. But far worse from Europe's point of view is actually what's happening in Ukraine. Now, America has held talks with Russia on ending the Ukraine war and has excluded Europe and Ukraine from the negotiating table. Trump has a relationship with Vladimir Putin, Russia's leader, which is offensive to a lot of Europeans who actually see Putin as a brutal dictator who launched the Ukraine war. What's actually shocking to Europe is that Trump seems ready to sign a deal with Russia that might not accommodate any of their concerns. So imagine that, the Europeans are being locked out of the room while the end of the biggest land war in Europe since the Second World War is being decided. For Europe, this is an act of betrayal by America. And what's worse is that Europe can do very little about it, since all of Europe is essentially dependent on America to continue giving military aid to Ukraine. Also, the reaction to the Trump-Zelensky meeting showed how fundamental the divide is now between the Western allies. Trump kicked Zelensky out of the White House while Europe welcomed him in as a hero and gave him billions of dollars to continue fighting the war. Now, could this divide get any worse? And could we actually see a total breakdown of the Western alliance? Now, the Western alliance probably won't break down because there is too much that binds them together and Trump is only president for 4 years. But trust and Europe's sense of security that America would back them through thick and thin has been totally shattered. And there is no going back. It is a momentous development in geopolitics. But that leads us to point 2, which is that Europe is finally waking up. Over the last couple of weeks, Europe has been having some very serious conversations. There have been suggestions about a joint defense fund for the whole continent. The United Kingdom and France could provide for nuclear security instead of America. And the continent as a whole is considering rearming for defense. All of this is actually really good news for a country like India, because Europe is going to be out in the world looking for new partners. So if you look at what happened last week, EU chief Ursula von der Leyen and pretty much the entire senior leadership of the EU was in India. And this visit was really practical. There were no lectures on human rights, no lectures on democracy or Kashmir. Instead, Europe pushed for a trade deal with India, more defense agreements, and more connectivity through the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor project, also known as IMEC. So given the fact that India and Europe have spent the last 3 years basically fighting about Ukraine, this is actually a really welcome shift in attitude. And it signals that the India-Europe relationship could really go places in the years to come. Speaking of Ukraine, we actually get to point 3, which is that India's Ukraine policy was right from the start. When the war broke out in 2022, India's policy was clear. Don't pick sides, push for diplomacy, and maintain strong ties with all countries. After the Trump-Zelensky meeting, that policy is looking smarter and smarter every single day. India has come through the war having preserved its relationships with America, Europe, and Russia. And the war is ending the way India said it would, through a negotiated settlement. When the war started, there was this push by many big Western powers for India to condemn and punish Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. Now, if India had actually done that, it would have damaged its relationship with Russia. And sure, Europe and America would have been happy for a while. But with Trump now proclaiming his friendship with Putin and Russia basically negotiating an end to the war with America, there really wouldn't have been any long-term benefits to India to taking that kind of policy. But there's also a couple of worrying things from that Trump-Zelensky meeting. But that brings us to point 4, which is that Trump's behavior in the Zelensky meeting is actually quite worrying to a country like India. You see, what that meeting really showed us is that Trump really wants a deal with Russia. He isn't interested in spending American money on the Ukraine war. He doesn't really care about getting a good deal for Europe and Ukraine. What he wants is a good deal for America, ends the war, and resumes economic ties with Moscow. And he is willing to sideline his own allies to do it. Which leads to an interesting question. what will Trump do when it comes to China? Now, Trump has been actually fairly silent on his China policy so far. But when he has talked about it, he said that he wants to get along with China. But so the big question is this: will Trump sideline partners in Asia like Japan, South Korea, or even India to get a deal with China? And this is actually a really important question that India needs to start asking itself. Because shared concern over China has been the strategic glue that has bound India and America over the last 10 years. Now, if Trump decides that he doesn't like expensive foreign military commitments or that he doesn't like foreign wars, will he just turn a blind eye to China's aggressive foreign policy in Asia? Because China might just say that, look, we, Beijing, can continue to take an aggressive position on Asian foreign policy questions. And America will not show up because Trump doesn't want to fight us. Every single country facing China in Asia has to be clear about one thing after the Trump-Zelensky meeting. Under Trump, America isn't a reliable friend. Many of them have to accept that, and many may start working much more closely with China. And India has a problem because it doesn't want to see an Asia that is dominated by Beijing. And that brings us to the last thing, point 5, which is that after the Trump-Zelensky meeting, America revealed that it is now a predatory superpower. Now, what does that phrase mean, predatory superpower? Over the last 80 years, America has actually played a leading role in building the international order that we see today. So institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, you name it, the Americans helped build it. Now, America has spent vast resources, billions of dollars, to keep that order alive. But under Trump, that is done. Trump wants countries to pay up for the privilege of America's friendship and protection. That's why Zelensky was actually in America, by the way. He was there to sign a minerals deal that would give Washington control over a large chunk of Ukraine's mineral resources. As one Asian defense minister put it, America under Trump is behaving like a landlord seeking rent. Now, part of this is understandable. There is no reason why rich European countries should depend on the Americans to provide for their security. And Americans are genuinely tired of playing this role as a security provider on the world stage and fighting wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Ukraine, and the Middle East. So the fact that Trump is looking for a better deal is not the problem. But Trump's style is really worrying. When countries don't give Trump what he wants, he's willing to throw his weight around to get his way. Everyone actually needs to go and read that initial minerals deal contract that was suggested by the Trump administration to Ukraine. It was basically a colonial document because it would give America massive control over Ukraine's natural resources. Also, think about Trump's threats to Panama, a much smaller country, over the country's canal, or his tariffs on allies like Canada and Mexico. The basic bottom line with Trump is that if you don't give him what he wants or you don't flatter him, it doesn't matter if you're an enemy or a wartime ally like Ukraine. You are simply getting in his way. And this sort of behavior has consequences for India. India and Prime Minister Modi were able to handle Trump fairly well in his first term. And during Modi's recent visit to America, India agreed to more defense purchases, big business deals, and we also agreed to buy more energy from America. But how long can India continue to do that? Even though Trump seems to like India and Prime Minister Modi right now, the two countries have serious differences on trade, on illegal immigration, and if Trump is going to use bullying and threats to get what he wants from India, things are not going to end well. So in the end, the Trump-Zelensky meeting revealed a lot about what kind of world we're going to be living in going forward. For many, especially in Europe, it is going to look like a much harsher and less safe world. And while India is better protected than a lot of other countries around the world, it also needs to prepare for a very, very difficult ride in international politics. Thank you so much for watching Threadbare with me, Shashank Mattu. You can catch the show again next week on India Today Global.